Hello everyone, this is Joshua Smith of Apollo's Artifacts. So I've just completed my two-part series on the history of the DSM, wherein one portion of it Dr. Jordan Peterson came up, and in another portion Dr. Jonathan Haidt came up. So I decided to look into one of the works that Dr. Haidt produced along with four other co-authors. This was published in PLOS 1, or PLOS 1, and it's called Understanding Libertarian Morality, the Psychological Dispositions of Self-Identified Libertarians. And the co-authors are Ravi Iyer, Spasina Koleva, Jesse Graham, Peter Ditto, and Jonathan Haidt, who is a social psychologist and works primarily on the psychology of morality. The abstract here says, this was published August 21st, 2012, and I will link the entire article below. Libertarians are an increasingly prominent ideological group in U.S. politics. I disagree with the ideological part. I don't think we are ideologues, but okay, I'll let that pass, since I don't think he's using it in the Marxist manner. Yet they have been largely unstudied. Across 16 measures in a large web-based example that included 11,994 self-identified libertarians, we sought to understand the moral and psychological characteristics of self-described libertarians. Based on an intuitionist view of moral judgment, we focused on the underlying affective and cognitive dispositions that accompany this unique worldview. Compared to self-identified liberals and conservatives, libertarians showed 1. Stronger endorsement of individual liberty as their foremost guiding principle, and weaker endorsement of all other moral principles. 2. A relatively cerebral as opposed to emotional cognitive style. That should be no shock to anybody who knows libertarians. That's just how we tend to be. And 3. Lower interdependence and social relatedness. As predicted by intuitionist theories concerning the origins of moral reasoning, libertarian values showed convergent relationships with libertarian emotional dispositions and social preferences. Our findings add to a growing recognition of the role of personality differences in the organization of political attitudes. And this was produced as an open access article under Creative Commons, and it permits unrestricted use, distribution, and reproduction in any medium, provided that the original author and sources are credited, which I have done and will do. And this is, of course, again, primarily for purposes of education, commentary, and criticism, as I will put before all articles that I cover. So they begin this here in the introduction. They start off with a quote from Ayn Rand, 1944. Quote, "Civilization is the process of setting man free from men," end quote. Now, they use Ayn Rand as a sort of moral exemplar or an essentialist avatar for libertarians in general. I personally would contest that usage. I would not use Ayn. I would select somebody more affable like Murray Rothbard. I think that Ayn Rand, from the things that I've read about her, was not a particularly agreeable person, and certainly would not have been a person who I would personally get along with at all. I am not an objectivist. I never have been, though I do enjoy some of the writings and works and scholarship of other objectivists. But they do fall into the category overall of libertarian, but I am not specifically of that brand of libertarian. Anyway, it begins here. Political psychologists have learned a great deal about the psychological differences between liberals and conservatives, but very little is known about the psychological characteristics of libertarians, who are sometimes described as being conservative on economic issues, e.g. against government regulation of free markets, but liberal on social issues, e.g. against government intrusion into private life matters, such as sex or drug use. In the United States, libertarians appear to be rising in both numbers and prominence in national politics. The presidential candidacies of Texas Congressman Ron Paul in 2008 and 2012, and the 2009 birth of the Tea Party movement, have greatly elevated the visibility and importance of libertarian ideas about individual liberty and the importance of limited government. Many Tea Party members are actually socially conservative but emphasize ideas about limited government that reflect libertarian principles. In this paper, we document libertarian moral psychology, which, as we show, is distinct from both liberal and conservative moralities. We use this unique group to illustrate how psychological dispositions predispose individuals to endorse particular values and choose coherent ideological identifications consistent with current models of moral intuitionism, ideological choice, and the moralization of preferences. One of the things that I like to say about libertarians, one of the things I believe anyway, is that on a good day, we probably are 5 to 10%, maybe 12% of the overall population. Now, what I mean by that are people who, as they're talking about in this article, self-identify as libertarians. They understand libertarian theory. They understand some of the history behind it. They understand some of the socio-political circumstances and things of that nature. Now, I think there are actually more people who are libertarian in their personal dispositions, but they don't really know very much about it. There was a point in time, of course, where I didn't know anything about the theories of it either, so it bounced around from various ill-defined aspects of being somewhat liberal, somewhat conservative, and it was not until I discovered more about libertarianism that I started to formulate more clearly my ideas about that. And as I have said before on this show, I did spend a considerable amount of time on the left. I understand leftist theories, leftist ideology to a rather strong degree, but it was the innumerable contradictions that kept coming up that drove me away. There were too many things that just did not jive with morality and didn't fit with reality at all. And it ended up ultimately pushing me away from that side. But just as I am not on the left, I am equally not on the right. I think that libertarianism is indeed unique. As Dr. Walter Block has said on many occasions, I am not a conservative, I am not a Republican, certainly not a Democrat. Continue the article here. The culture war fought out in American public and political life since the 1980s has often been described in binary terms as a conflict between two visions of morality and moral authority. On the right, the conservative side has insisted that there is an objective moral truth. I would agree with them there. Traditional institutions are seen as embodying the wisdom of the ages and therefore closely reflecting this moral truth. On the left, the liberal side has insisted that moral truth is not fixed for all time but is a work in progress to be reinterpreted toward the goal of promoting greater well-being for all. Psychologists have been able to measure these differences in moral judgment along with their underlying personality correlates. For example, political conservatism has been found to be associated with greater tolerance of inequality and lesser tolerances of change, greater conscientiousness, and greater sensitivity to disgust. Political liberals, on the other hand, tend to be more open than conservatives to new experiences and more empathic. This research has been an important first step in understanding the ideology-personality relation and the psychological organization of political attitudes. Rosen highlighted the importance of identifying real-world invariants in meaningful parts of life, for which political ideology certainly qualifies. Yet within research on ideology, libertarianism with its mix of liberal and conservative sensibilities has gone largely unstudied. Libertarian ideology prescribes a certain unique pattern of moral concerns that cannot be readily classified on the standard left-right dimension. But as with differences between liberals and conservatives, these unique sensibilities should be measurable using existing psychological scales. In this paper, we empirically address the question of what dispositional traits, emotions, and social preferences predict social identification as libertarian. Based on the stated beliefs of libertarian intellectual leaders, as well as previous research on the social and intuitive origins of moral beliefs, we generate 3 broad expectations about libertarian psychology and evaluate them in a large data set across a variety of psychological characteristics. In addition to providing a detailed empirical description of the distinct moral psychological profile of individuals who self-identify as libertarians in the U.S. context, we examined the relations between their dispositional traits, values, and social preferences, allowing us more general insight into the origins of moral judgment, which can then be applied to any group with this distinct psychological profile. Libertarian Ideology. Modern libertarians are attitudinally diverse, but all types of libertarianism trace their origins back to the Enlightenment thinkers of the 17th and 18th century who argued that states, laws, and governments exist for the benefit of the people. The individual is the unit of value, and the liberty of the individual is the essential precondition for human flourishing. John Locke wrote, quote, "The great and chief end, therefore, of men's uniting into commonwealths and putting themselves under government is the preservation of their property." End quote. Locke had an expansive notion of property, which included men's lives, liberties, and estates. His ideas were later paraphrased into one of the most famous phrases in the Declaration of Independence: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Careful with the pursuit of happiness part there. Libertarianism has historically rejected the idea that the needs of one person impose a moral duty upon others. This is one of the major points on which liberals and libertarians diverged in the 20th century. Libertarianism stayed close to Locke's and Mill's notions of liberty as freedom from interference, which the philosopher Isaiah Berlin later called negative liberty. But beginning in the progressive era of the late 19th century, the American left began to adopt European ideas about the conditions and entitlements that people need to make the most of their liberty. Government action came to be seen as essential for ensuring positive liberty by providing the social conditions such as education, healthcare, and financial security to give people the freedom to pursue their own happiness. See what I meant by be careful about the happiness part? And I'll point out the problems with this in great detail in a book that I am working on now that I hope to have out in early 2018, maybe February or March or something like that. I'm not sure yet when it will be. But anytime you start having people making these positive rights claims, what those ultimately are claims on others to provide the conditions for that possibility, i.e. they end up wanting to take money from some to give to others, and it's forcefully taking the money, okay? Money at the barrel of a gun. It is not a simple donation or charity or anything like that. So we continue the article. Seen in this light, it becomes clear why American libertarians are sometimes called classical liberals, and in Europe, the term liberal is often used in the same way that classical liberal is in the United States. It also becomes clear why libertarian thought is now associated with anti-government and anti-progressive movements. Libertarianism provides an ideological narrative whereby the opposition to high taxes and big government is not just an economic position, it is a moral position as well. This narrative provides the basis for principled opposition to a government seen as unfair because it takes from the productive and gives to the unproductive, tyrannical because it violates the negative liberty of some people to promote the positive liberty of others, and wasteful because governments rarely achieve the efficiencies generated by the competitive competition of private firms. And boy, is that ever the case. The psychological roots of the libertarian ideology. The most obvious psychological characteristic of libertarian ideology is the value placed on negative liberty as an overriding moral principle, as can be seen in this quote concerning a law outlawing online gambling from U.S. Congressman Ron Paul, the most libertarian contender in recent times for the nomination of a major political party. And I would also point out that Dr. Paul is a Christian, and I'm sure as such he personally does not like gambling at all, but he has defended it. Here we'll go with the quote. The most basic principle to being a free American is the notion that we as individuals are responsible for our own lives and decisions. We do not have the right to rob our neighbors to make up for our mistakes. Neither does our neighbor have any right to tell us how to live, so long as we aren't infringing on their rights. There are those that feel online gambling is morally wrong and financially irresponsible, which I do not argue with, but they also feel that because of this, the government should step in and prevent or punish people for taking part in these activities. This attitude is anathema to the ideas of liberty. He is 100% correct there. Libertarians appear to have a coherent moral philosophy, which includes a general opposition to forcing any particular moral code upon others. Note that Paul is not saying that gambling is morally acceptable. Rather, he is saying that negative liberty has a moral value that supersedes other moral considerations. Libertarians seem willing to reject both liberal concerns for social justice and conservative concerns for respecting existing social structure when those concerns conflict with their superordinate interest in maintaining individual liberty. The goal of our first study is to confirm these observations by directly surveying a broad range of moral values and concerns, testing whether self-described libertarians place a higher value on liberty and a lower value on other moral concerns, compared to self-described liberals and conservatives. But what might explain the libertarian focus on liberty to the exclusion of other moral concerns? Recent work in moral psychology suggests that moral attitudes arise, at least in part, from low-level dispositional traits, emotional reactions, social function, and the moralization of preferences. These moral attitudes have, in turn, been found to be associated with ideological self-identification. And I wrote out to the side here, I wonder if these are merely artifacts of categorization, which is one of the same problems that came up in my history of the DSM. It's a perpetual problem, I guess, of the way that we label and identify concepts and define them. Continuing. This work suggests that one explanation for the unique moral profile of libertarians is that they feel traditional moral concerns less than do most other people. Tetlock found that libertarians were less morally outraged by taboo moral trade-offs, e.g. buying and selling body parts for transplantation, than were liberals, conservatives, or socialists. Recent research in moral psychology has emphasized the importance of intuitive and emotional reactions in producing moral judgments that appear on their face to be based on principled reasoning. Might libertarians be more tolerant on issues of private consensual behavior than conservatives because they exhibit lower levels of disgust sensitivity? Might libertarians depart from liberals on social justice issues because they have weaker feelings of empathy? Indeed, libertarian writers have historically been proud of the rational rather than the emotional roots of their ideology. The possible exception to this rule, of course, is the vigorous reaction libertarians often have to violations of personal freedom. Libertarians' characteristic pattern of emotional reactions and lack thereof may constrain the types of concerns that they moralize, which in turn affects their attraction to libertarian self-identification. We investigate this possibility in Study 2. This is one of the portions that I would, personally have an issue with, because my emotional complexes of personality traits and whatnot have not changed whatsoever from the time that I considered myself to be on the left, which was probably, an 8-year, 10-year, maybe even 12-year period before I had a clear understanding of where I ought to be on the political spectrum, which was not on the political spectrum, but off of it. So, but maybe that's just me. Continuing, finally, emotional reactions and the moral principles that derive from them serve interpersonal functions such as navigating the social world and forming groups with others. Libertarians may have a dispositional preference for independence, perhaps even solitude, and therefore less use of the moral principles that bind them to others. In The Fountainhead, Ayn Rand writes about the importance of maintaining one's individuality within social relationships. Do libertarians identify less with the people in their lives, with groups, and with their nations? Do they derive less enjoyment from the company of others? This relative preference for individualism may gradually become moralized into a conscious endorsement of liberty as a moral principle, predisposing them to a libertarian self-identification. We investigate these possibilities in Study 3. Getting libertarians together on almost anything is very much akin to attempting to herd cats. The current research. In this paper, we let libertarians speak for themselves. We report the results of 16 surveys in which a total of 11,994 self-identified libertarians participated. We show how self-described libertarians differ from self-described liberals and conservatives, not just on their moral beliefs, but on a variety of personality measures that, given previous research on the emotional and social origins of moral reasoning, help us to understand why libertarians may hold their unique pattern of moral beliefs. Our goal, however, was not just to describe the moral intuitions and dispositional traits of libertarians. Our second goal was to provide further evidence for the dispositional origins of ideology, the role of intuition in moral attitudes, and the role that social functioning plays in moral thinking. More specifically, we sought to replicate tests of a predictive model of ideological identification that is similar to McAdams' framework of personality. McAdams' three-level account of personality posits that the lowest level consists of global decontextualized dispositional traits such as the Big Five or disgust sensitivity. Level 2 refers to a person's characteristic adaptations such as values, goals, attachment styles, and defense mechanisms. McAdams' third level consists of integrative life stories, which are the idiosyncratic stories that people tell themselves about themselves. These stories often weave the level 1 and level 2 constructs into narratives that help people understand and justify their particular moral values. Haidt, Graham, and Joseph modified McAdams' third level for work in political psychology by pointing out that not all of these stories are self-constructed. We do not explicitly examine integrative narratives in this study, but when one gravitates toward an existing political party or ideology, one takes on many of the ideological narratives that have been laboriously constructed over decades by authors such as Ayn Rand, who, not coincidentally, put most of her political philosophy into narrative form in her novels. To apply this model to the study of libertarians, we first show that libertarians do indeed have a distinct profile of moral concerns. We then show that dispositional traits relate to ideological identification and that this relationship is often mediated by moral intuitions, which can be thought of as a type of characteristic adaptation in McAdams' terminology. In Study 3, we showed that the specific moral concerns relate to distinct styles of social functioning and that libertarians' unique moral profile relates to their social preferences. Consistent with theories of parallel constraint satisfaction, we showed that libertarianism can be understood as a set of relationships between a broad number of dispositional traits, social preferences, and moral values. We begin with 3 general predictions. 1. Libertarians will value liberty more strongly and consistently than liberals or conservatives at the expense of other moral concerns. This expectation is based on the explicit writings of libertarian authors. 2. Libertarians will rely upon emotion less and reason more than will either liberals or conservatives. This expectation is based on previous research on the effective origins of moral judgment, as well as libertarians' own self-characterizations. For example, one of the main libertarian magazines is called simply Reason. 3. Libertarians will be more individualistic and less collectivist compared to both liberals and conservatives. This expectation is based on previous research concerning the social function of moral judgment. Libertarians often refer to the right to be left alone and show strong reactance toward social and legal pressures to join groups or assume obligations toward others that are not freely chosen. We evaluate these predictions in 3 studies using large web-based examples and a variety of measures related to morality, cognition, emotion, and social relatedness. Each study is actually a collection of separate studies that were conducted by a data collection website, all described below for the presentation purposes. We group them together based on the predictions they address. And then they have a long section here on the methods employed. This is all typical material for psychology studies. They go over the overall design of the study, etc. and so forth. I'll move forward simply to the section on results and discussion. Study 1, Describing Libertarian Morality. They begin with a quote, Ayn Rand again, "If any civilization is to survive, it is the morality of altruism that men have to reject." Our first prediction was that compared to liberals and conservatives, the morality of libertarians would be characterized by a strong endorsement of individual liberty at the expense of other moral considerations. We addressed this question by examining several measures designed to give a broad overview of a person's values and morals, and they talk about that part. Moral Foundations Questionnaire, the MFQ, measures the degree to which a person relies on each of the 5 moral foundations: harm, care, fairness, reciprocity, in-group, loyalty, authority, respect, and purity, sanctity. The scale has 2 parts. The first measures abstract assessments of moral relevance, e.g., when you decide whether something is right or wrong, to what extent do you consider whether or not someone suffered emotionally for harm, and the second measures agreement with the more specific moral statements, e.g., I would call some acts wrong on the grounds that they are unnatural for purity. Results section. The first 5 rows of Table 2 show D scores indicating how libertarians differed from liberals and conservatives on the MFQ. Libertarians were similar to conservatives on the Fairness Foundation, as both groups scored substantially lower than liberals. However, like liberals, libertarians scored substantially lower on the in-group, authority, and purity foundations compared to conservatives. Finally, libertarians scored slightly lower than conservatives and substantially lower than liberals on the harm foundation. Interpretation. Our results suggests why libertarians do not feel fully at home in either of the major American political parties. Consistent with our prediction, libertarians were relatively low on all 5 foundations. Libertarians share with liberals a distaste for the morality of in-group authority and purity, characteristic of social conservatives. Like liberals, libertarians can be said to have a 2-foundation morality, prioritizing harm and fairness above the other 3 foundations. But libertarians share with conservatives their moderate scores on these 2 foundations. They are therefore likely to be less responsive than liberals to moral appeals from groups who claim to be victimized, oppressed, or treated unfairly. Libertarianism is clearly not just a point on the liberal-conservative continuum. Libertarians have a unique pattern of moral concerns with relatively low reliance on all 5 foundations. The next part sorts value scales. I'll move to the results section. Libertarians were unique on 2 values: benevolence, where they scored moderately below the other 2 groups, and self-direction, where they scored the highest, slightly higher than liberals and moderately higher than conservatives. And I wrote out to the side here is this meaning that they are internally more driven or motivated. Perhaps that is the case. I mean, I listened to a recent podcast from Tom Woods where he had Michael Malice on, and they were doing like a year-end wrap-up of 2017, and Dr. Woods was talking about how he just can't really seem to relax. Like even when he goes on a vacation, he said he would look at his fellow vacationers sort of with a sense of disgust, like, look how lazy these people are, they're not doing anything. And he talked about like waiting for an elevator, that he's the type of person who feels like, I'm missing out on reading time here where I could be doing something productive. And I also very much identify with that. I am a voracious and perpetual reader. I constantly feel like I have to be doing something, whether I'm listening to a podcast or a YouTube video or something that is positively productive or something that builds upon my knowledge base. And where that comes from, I have no idea, but it is something that I literally almost cannot ever turn off. Down in the section for interpretation, they say, once again, we see that libertarians look somewhat like liberals, but assign lower importance to values related to the welfare or suffering of others, the benevolence value, and universalism. It is also noteworthy that the highest mean for any sort's value dimension was libertarians' endorsement of self-direction. Self-direction was the most strongly endorsed value for all 3 groups, but for libertarians the difference was quite large compared to the next most endorsed value, achievement. If libertarians have indeed elevated self-direction as their foremost guiding principle, then they may see the needs and claims of others, whether based on liberal or conservative principles, as a threat to their primary value. On the ethics position questionnaire, and this part was a tad surprising for me, but I'll go ahead here. It's composed of 2 10-item subscales, so on and so forth, related to what lies at the heart of an individual's moral code. Relativism concerns whether or not an individual believes that moral principles are universal, e.g. what is ethical varies from one situation in society to another. The scale is commonly used in the business ethics literature, has been shown to predict a moral behavior in ethical situations. Results. Table 2 shows that libertarians score moderately lower than liberals and slightly lower than conservatives on moral idealism. Libertarians score moderately higher than conservatives and similar but lower than liberals on moral relativism. Interpretation. According to Forsyth's classification system, individuals who score high in relativism and low on idealism, the pattern found for libertarians, are labeled subjectivists, who reject moral rules and base moral judgments on personal feelings about the action and the setting. Subjectivists have been found to be more lenient in judging individuals who violate moral norms. This result is consistent with our findings for the MFQ and Schwartz value scales, in that libertarians appear to live in a world where traditional moral concerns, e.g. altruism, respect for authority, are not assigned much importance. And I'm not so much sure how respect for authority is a moral concern whatsoever. And in terms of this whole subjectivism, relativism thing, and absolutism and universalism, I would just suggest that you find Stefan Molyneux's book, UPB, Universally Preferable Behavior, and you'll see a whole different take on the libertarian divide there. But I guess overall what this study shows is that libertarianism just tends to attract a certain contingent of moral relativists. for whatever reason. But I also think that a questionnaire study like this would come out with these results almost necessarily once you understand more about how libertarian thinking about ethics and morality works, which will become much more clear once I finish my book and get it out, because I think I've figured out almost precisely where those divides are and why they take place. So they talk about the good self scale, the perhaps it's pronounced good, I don't know. The good self-assessment is a measure of moral self-relevance, or the degree to which one sees moral rather than non-moral traits as part of his or her self-concept. This is a slightly modified version of the original. For the moral traits, we replace sincere and helpful with kind and loyal, so on and so forth. Results. Table 2 shows that libertarians scored moderately lower than liberals and substantially lower than conservatives on the self-relevance of moral traits. They did not differ from liberals and conservatives on the importance they ascribe to non-moral traits. We also examined the non-moral term independent separately and found that liberals and conservatives scored significantly lower than libertarians. Interpretation. The results suggest that libertarians are less likely to see moral traits as important to their core self compared to liberals and conservatives. At the same time, they are just as likely as these two groups to base their self-concept around positive non-moral characteristics such as being funny or outgoing. Notably, libertarians were the only group to report valuing pragmatic, non-moral traits more than moral traits. Libertarians may hesitate to view traits that engender obligations to others, e.g. loyal, generous, sympathetic, as important parts of who they are because such traits imply being altruistic. And I wrote out to the side here, this could be a bit of a red herring, and I have questions about it. But we continue. Lifestyle and economic government liberty. In the original conception of moral foundations theory, concerns about liberty or autonomy or freedom were not measured, but as we began to collect data on libertarians and to hear objections from libertarians that their core value was not well represented, we created questions related to liberty in the style of the Moral Foundations Questionnaire. Move down to the portion on results from this. Table 2 shows that libertarians scored highest on both kinds of liberty. On economic government liberty, liberals were the outlier, scoring below the midpoint of the scale, 2 full standard deviations below libertarians. On lifestyle liberty, libertarians scored substantially higher than both liberals and conservatives. Interpretation. Libertarians are not unconcerned about all aspects of morality, as suggested by their scores on the MFQ and several other widely used morality scales. Rather, consistent with their self-descriptions, they care about liberty. Like conservatives, they endorse a world in which people are left alone to enjoy the fruits of their own labor, free from government interference. They also exceed both liberals and conservatives, but are closer to liberals overall in endorsing personal or lifestyle liberty. The paper then moves into a lengthy portion on the question of, do libertarians have a unique moral profile? They talk about the way that they went about this analysis and whatnot. We come down to their interpretation, and it unsurprisingly concludes that the above analysis suggests that libertarians indeed do hold an empirically different set of values compared to both liberals or conservatives. This is not to say, however, that libertarians are devoid of moral concerns. Contemporary moral psychology has paid little attention to the valuation of negative liberty as a specifically moral concern. Independence may be seen as a pragmatic value. Respecting the autonomy of others may be seen as a way to promote the welfare of individuals, consistent with liberal ideas about positive liberty, rather than as an independent moral construct. It is predictable, then, that on such measures, libertarians appear amoral, i.e. lacking in the activation of common moral systems. However, our results show that libertarians score substantially higher than liberals and conservatives on measures of both economic and lifestyle liberty, and the centrality of independence to one's core self. Libertarians may fear that the moral concerns typically endorsed by liberals or conservatives are claims that can be used to trample upon individual rights, libertarians' sacred value. If liberty is included as a moral value, libertarians are not amoral. Rather, standard morality scales simply do a poor job of measuring libertarian values. Study 2. How do libertarians think and feel? Yet another quote from Ayn Rand. Quote, every aspect of Western culture needs a new code of ethics, a rational ethics, as a precondition of birth, end quote. In Study 2, we sought to examine cognitive and emotional differences among libertarians, liberals, and conservatives. given the well-documented influence of emotions on moral judgment and behavior. If it turns out that libertarians feel fewer or weaker moral emotions, then it is understandable that their morality would be substantially different from that of liberals and conservatives. In place of a system of morality deriving from emotion, libertarians have explicitly sought a rational ethics. Among the main traits that have been found to distinguish liberals from conservatives are those related to cognitive style. Liberals score higher on traits related to tolerance for ambiguity, need for cognition, and openness to experience. Based on the explicitly intellectual focus of libertarian writing and on their general lack of concern for tradition and traditional morality, we expected that libertarians would generally resemble liberals on such measures. These considerations led us to our second prediction. Libertarians will reveal a cognitive style that depends less on emotion and more on reason than will either liberals or conservatives. We move down to a portion on Big Five personality inventory. They go through the results, then the interpretation. In the interpretation portion, the libertarian pattern on the Big Five complements our findings on their explicit values in Study 1. Libertarians report lower levels of the traits that indicate an orientation toward engaging with and pleasing others. Low scores on agreeableness, in particular, have been said to indicate a lack of compassion and a critical, skeptical nature. Table 3 shows that libertarians scored moderately lower than conservatives and substantially lower than liberals on empathic concern for others. Libertarians scored slightly lower than liberals and similar to conservatives on personal distress, perspective taking, and fantasy. Going to move past the section on disgust to the empathizer systematizer scale. The empathizer systematizer scale, adapted from Baron Cohen, yes, that would be the comedian's relative, measures the tendency to empathize, defined as the drive to identify another person's emotions and thoughts and to respond to these with an appropriate emotion, and to systematize, or the drive to analyze the variables in a system and to derive the underlying rules that govern the behavior of the system. And I would say libertarians are basically the king systematizers among systematizers. It's just something that we all tend to do. In short, empathizing is about understanding the social world, whereas systematizing is about understanding the world of inanimate objects and nature. Results. Table 3 shows that libertarians scored the lowest of any group on empathizing and the highest on systematizing. In Figure 4, they label as libertarians exhibit a reason-based cognitive style according to a variety of measures. Interpretation. Research by Baron Cohen has shown that relatively high systematizing and low empathizing scores are characteristic of the male brain, with the very extreme scores indicating autism. We might say that liberals have the most feminine cognitive style and libertarians have the most masculine. These effects hold even when men and women are examined separately. Indeed, the feminizing of the Democratic Party in the 1970s may help explain why libertarians moved increasingly into the Republican Party in the 1980s. Section called Need for Cognition. The Need for Cognition scale is a measure of the extent to which people engage in and enjoy effortful cognitive activities. People with high need for cognition are more likely to form their attitudes by paying close attention to relevant arguments, whereas people with low need for cognition are more likely to rely on peripheral cues, such as how attractive or credible a speaker is. Results. Table 3 shows that libertarians scored slightly higher than liberals and moderately higher than conservatives on need for cognition. Interpretation. This pattern is consistent with the libertarian valuation of logic and reasoning over emotion. Libertarians may enjoy thinking about complex and abstract systems more than other groups, particularly more than conservatives. We next move into a portion called Moral Dilemmas. 6 moral dilemmas adapted from Green et al. Were given to each participant. Each dilemma required a choice about whether to take an action to save multiple individuals at the cost of a single individual's life. Each dilemma was modified so that there was one more version, e.g., push this stranger off of a bridge and onto the tracks below where his large body will stop a trolley, so on and so forth. We move down to the results section of this, and it shows that Table 3, libertarians were moderately more utilitarian than conservatives and slightly more utilitarian than liberals. Their judgments were more utilitarian in both the more aversive and less aversive scenarios. The results from these moral dilemmas, which are devoid of political content, indicate that libertarians are indeed more capable of rational ethics where costs and benefits are weighed according to utilitarian principles, given the body of evidence suggesting that utilitarian judgments in these dilemmas are more likely to be reached by a, quote, cold calculation, and that deontological or rights-based judgments are more likely to be reached via, quote, hot affective processes. Our results suggest that libertarians are particularly unemotional in their moral deliberations. Personally, I fall more into the deontological camp here, and when I finish my book and get that out, you'll see precisely what I mean by that and why there are numerous problems with utilitarianism for libertarians specifically. Next section, cognitive reflection task. The cognitive reflection task is a set of 3 logic questions that have correct and intuitive answers. Correct answers on these questions is said not just to measure intelligence, but also a measure of a person's ability to suppress an intuitive response in service of the cognitive reasoning required to solve these problems. In the results section, Table 3 shows that libertarians find the correct answers to these questions at a slightly higher rate than liberals and moderately higher rate compared to conservatives. Interpretation. The cognitive reflection task provides a behavioral validation of the hypothesis that libertarians have a more reasoned cognitive style. In our data set, this measure intercorrelates with both need for cognition and the Baron-Cohen systematizer scores, with libertarians scoring higher than both liberals and conservatives on all 3 measures. Taken together, a convergent picture of the rational cognitive style of libertarians emerges. I'm going to move past a section here called Do Libertarian Dispositions Lead to Libertarian Values? There's a lot of interesting material there, but you can read that on your own time if you wish. Move to the section called Study 2 Summary. How do libertarians think and feel? As predicted, libertarians showed lower levels of emotional responsiveness on standard measures of the moral emotions of disgust and empathy. Libertarians were the only group to report a more systematic rather than empathic way of understanding the world, a characteristic of men that may explain why libertarianism appeals to men more than women. Libertarians show low valuation of traditional moral concerns contrasted sharply with the uniquely high moral value they placed on liberty. Libertarians also reported lower levels of agreeableness measured using items such as likes to cooperate with others. The use of liberty rhetoric may have different psychological origins in different political groups. Autonomy is posited to be a universal basic human psychological need, and thus liberals may be attracted to liberty as a means of improving the psychological welfare of individuals. Similarly, social conservatives may be attracted to liberty as a means toward opposing redistributive taxation policies that challenge the status quo, yet still feel comfortable with the lifestyle liberty constraints that tradition and conformity require. In contrast, libertarians may not see liberty as a means, but rather as an end in and of itself, based on their heightened feelings of psychological reactance. It is also evident in libertarians' fondness for the historical phrase, "don't tread on me," which, by the way, is not a racist phrase for those of you out there concerned with that, which became a slogan of Ron Paul's 2008 presidential campaign and is frequently displayed on signs and flags at rallies. Consistent with their stated preference for rationality, libertarians seem to enjoy effortful and thoughtful cognitive tasks. In combination with low levels of emotional reactivity, the highly rational nature of libertarians may lead them to a logical rather than emotional system of morality, explaining their unique pattern of scores on the moral psychology measures used in Study 1. In other words, we are the Spocks on this particular enterprise. This logical system of morality may have led libertarians to be able to provide correct rather than intuitive answers on the cognitive reflection task and to make more utilitarian judgments in the moral dilemmas presented to them in Study 2. Libertarians report being relatively open to new experiences and desiring stimulation, yet given the pattern of results from the study, it is likely true that libertarians may prefer intellectually stimulating experiences over emotionally stimulating experiences, such as social experiences. In conclusion, we found strong support for our second prediction that libertarians will rely upon emotion less and reason more than will either liberals or conservatives. Further, multivariate models suggest that these emotional differences may lead to certain value orientations, which in turn predispose individuals toward libertarian self-identification. Study 3. How do libertarians relate to others? Ayn Rand, 1943, quote, "To say, 'I love you,' one must first be able to say the I." That reminds me of the Michael Jordan quote about there is no I in team, but there is a me, he said. One of the primary purposes of moral concerns such as conformity, tradition, authority, and group loyalty is to bind individuals together. The same areas of the brain that are essential to normal, implicit, intuitive moral reasoning have also been found to be essential for navigating the human social world. The libertarian endorsement of the liberty principle might be related to their lower levels of agreeableness and higher levels of psychological reactance, but it could also result in part from lower levels of extroversion and a desire to be free of the constraints that relationships often entail, like you don't want to help that person move their stuff from one place to another, or something to that effect, perhaps. I don't know. Libertarians may be members of an ultra-social species who happen to prefer less social connection than their liberal and conservative peers. Study 3 suggests test the idea that libertarians will be more individualistic and less collectivist compared to both liberals and conservatives. So in this section called Individualism, Collectivism, the Individualism-Collectivism scale is a 32-item scale that measures an individual's level of independence versus interdependence. Individualists tend to emphasize self-reliance, independence, and sometimes competition. There are two types of individualism: horizontal individualism, which reflects a belief that people are separate, independent, but equal entities, e.g., I am a unique individual; and vertical individualism emphasizes hierarchy and competitiveness between those separate entities. It is important that I do my job better than others. Collectivists, on the other hand, tend to emphasize cooperation and sometimes equality. As with individualism, there are two kinds of collectivism: a more egalitarian or horizontal dimension, e.g., the well-being of my coworkers is important to me, and a more hierarchical vertical one, e.g., children should be taught to place duty before pleasure. Results. Table 4 shows that libertarians scored lowest on both forms of collectivism and highest on horizontal individualism, while matching conservatives on their high scores relative to liberals on vertical individualism. Interpretation. Libertarians appear more individualistic and less collectivistic than both liberals and conservatives. The relative preference for individualism occurs in both hierarchical and non-hierarchical circumstances. Identification with all of humanity. The Identification with all of humanity scale is a 27-item measure of connection to people in one's community, one's country, and the world. It asks 9 questions concerning each of these groups, e.g., how much would you say you have in common with the following groups, so on and so forth. Results. Table 4 shows that libertarians are less identified with their community compared to both liberals and conservatives. They also scored low, just below liberals, on identification with country, which was the dimension that conservatives most strongly endorsed. In addition, they scored low, equal to conservatives, on identification with people all over, quote, the world, which was the dimension that liberals most strongly endorsed. That's the I'm a global citizen phrase that you'll get from liberals a lot, or leftists. Interpretation. Consistent with the libertarian desire for personal liberty, libertarians feel relatively low levels of connection to their community, country, and people globally. This pattern suggests that libertarians are likely to join conservatives in opposing transnational humanitarian undertakings, and they are likely to join with liberals in opposing projects and legislation that are aimed at strengthening national identity. Different types of love scale. The different types of love scale is a 40-item measure of loving feelings toward 4 different groups. Participants indicate agreement with the statements concerning friends, e.g., the connection I feel to my friends is strengthened by all we have in common. Family. My mom and or dad's acts of unconditional love fill me with strong feelings of love. Generic others. Doing kind things for others is a reward in and of itself. And their romantic partner. I feel love whenever anything reminds me of my partner. Results. Table 4 shows that libertarians showed the lowest levels of loving feelings toward others across all 4 categories, although the difference with conservatives on love for friends was not significant. Interpretation. Consistent with the results on the identification with all of humanity scale, the libertarian independence from others is associated with weaker loving feelings towards family, friends, romantic partners, and generic others. It is noteworthy that differences between liberals and conservatives were generally small, except toward generic others. Libertarians were the outliers. And I said, as always, thus they have low representation in society overall. And I would also say that these particular traits don't apply to me at all. The next section is, does libertarian individualism relate to libertarian values? Then they have a long section here on their methodology, how they went about assessing that, so on and so forth. Study 3 summary, how do libertarians relate to others? As predicted, libertarians in our sample appeared to be strongly individualistic. Compared to liberals and conservatives, they report feeling a weaker sense of connection to their family members, romantic partners, friends, communities, and nations, as well as to humanity at large. While liberals exhibit a horizontal collectivistic orientation and conservatives a vertical collectivistic orientation, libertarians exhibit neither type of collectivism, instead displaying a distinctly individualistic orientation. Libertarians' weaker social interconnectedness is consistent with the idea that they have weaker moral intuitions concerning obligations to and dependence upon others. Conclusions. While not all libertarians endorse the views of Ayn Rand, our findings can be summarized by the 3 quotations we have presented from her work. We began study 1 with Rand's exhortation to reject the morality of altruism, and we showed that libertarians do indeed reject this morality as well as all other moralities based on ideas of obligation to other people, groups, traditions, and authorities. Libertarians scored relatively high on just one moral concern, liberty. The libertarian pattern of response was found to be empirically distinct from the responses of liberals and conservatives, both in our cluster analysis of participants and in our principal components analysis of measures. We found strong support for our first prediction. Libertarians will value liberty more strongly and consistently than liberals or conservatives at the expense of other moral concerns. We introduced study 2 with Rand's claim that Western culture can only be reborn when it can be founded on a rational ethics. And I would say that's more born out of Rand's obsession with the Enlightenment and Enlightenment values and all of that, which was a direct response to Christianity and its attempts to undermine the Christian structure of civilization. Move down to another part here. It says the angry reaction to infringements upon one's autonomy, for which libertarians scored higher than both liberals and conservatives. This disposition toward reactants may lead to the moralization of liberty and an attraction to an ideology that exalts liberty above other moral principles, namely libertarianism. We also found that libertarians showed a strong preference for and enjoyment of reasoning, higher on utilitarianism, need for cognition, systematizing, and a greater likelihood of answering correctly on the cognitive reflection task. And I would think, too, this is also related to why you see so many of these studies that show libertarians tend to have the highest IQs out of all of the political and moral groupings that are out there. They generally score quite off the charts on those. And they consistently exhibit a high degree of individualism and a low degree of collectivism. They have another section here on personality and ideology. I'm not going to read this section either, other than maybe this part here. A related way to describe the links between personality and morality found in Rosen's description of the moralization of preferences. Libertarians' preferences about how to live their lives may have been transformed into a moral value, the value of liberty, in the same way that vegetarians have been found to moralize their eating preferences or non-smokers moralize their aversion to smoke. From a social intuitionist perspective, this process is no different from the psychological comfort that liberals attain in moralizing their empathic responses, or that social conservatives attain in moralizing their connection to their groups. For those who self-identify as libertarian in our example, their dispositional and motivational profiles all point toward one supreme moral principle, which is individual liberty. They have an extensive section here on limitations of the study, where they talk about how there could be, lots of room for error and flaws and sampling problems and missing particular groups who have certain viewpoints and all of this. And that I think would be borne out a lot in the portion where they were talking about the relationship between libertarians and moral or ethical relativism. I know that there are a significant number of libertarians who are actually Catholics, and I would not categorize that particular group as being moral or ethical relativists in any way whatsoever, and I think maybe they're just not captured in the study for whatever reason. Move down to the final portion here of summary. Political and social psychologists often study ideology on a unidimensional liberal-conservative spectrum, but the real world is clearly more complex. As psychologists advance in studying the personality traits associated with liberalism and conservatism, our findings confirm the value of this approach and extend its reach to describing a heretofore neglected yet politically important group, libertarians. Libertarians have a unique moral psychological profile, endorsing the principles of liberty as an end and devaluing many of the moral concerns typically endorsed by liberals or conservatives. Although causal conclusions remain beyond our current reach, our findings indicate a robust relationship between libertarian morality, a dispositional lack of emotionality, and a preference for weaker, less binding social relationships. These findings are consistent with previous research on the dispositional origins of moral judgment. By focusing on one understudied ideological group, the findings provide further evidence concerning the closely intertwined nature of personality, values, and political ideology. And I would also take the opportunity here to point out that in national elections, it's always important to try to get as many of the libertarians on your side as possible, because as I always point out about elections, is they are decided by the people who are basically uncommitted, the people who are on the fences, the undecideds, the independents. You have to find a way to bring them over. And with libertarians specifically, I would say, like in boxing terms or fighting terms, MMA or whatever you want to say, they punch or hit above their weight. Libertarians are, a powerful force overall, even though a tiny portion of the society in general. But that's all. Thanks.